Hello there. Sounds like you've made the ill-fated decision to go to grad school, or at least you're thinking about it. My name is Stephen Summers, and I've got a PhD from the University of Oregon, and I now work at the College of Business at Oregon State University. I spent 6 years in graduate school, and I lived to tell the tale, so it is possible to survive. Um, what I want to talk about for just a few minutes here is what you're in for in some ways, looking at any kind of graduate study, and what are some of the common themes that can help you survive that time and make it a useful time, right? Not just a time of suffering and self questioning and doubt. And I think there are a lot of lessons I learned along the way throughout grad school, and I feel like the value of that process was not just in the degree that I got at the end of it, but it was also in deciding, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of work do I want to do? What are the things I really believe in? What makes me want to get up in the morning? And so graduate school had a way of really directing my career, and it gave me opportunities and options that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So as much as it was a lot of work and much longer than any program seems like it should ever be in retrospect, um, I'm not sorry that I went. I think it was a really helpful and really practical way for me to move forward, both with my career and with my goals. Um, Depending on what you want to study and where you're going to graduate school, like your experience is going to vary widely, right? And so that's why I'm focusing on just sort of five central principles that can help guide you, no matter what kind of graduate study you decide to do. And these principles are thinking about, five different T words: um, time, texts, tendencies, tribe, and treasure. So, kind of thinking about five different big topics that can help you hopefully make the most of this time of your life. And so, I just want to start with that first one: time, right? And I think one of the biggest changes between graduate school and undergraduate education is that your time is suddenly yours in a way that maybe it wasn't even as an undergrad. Um, you manipulate your schedule. You work things in your life the way that they make sense, because typically you're not going to be in the classroom very much. You're going to be juggling all your other life responsibilities like work and teaching and family and personal hygiene and all those things, but you're not necessarily going to have as structured of a schedule. And so for those people who find it much easier to learn in a very structured environment where the schedule is really laid out for them, and there's somebody holding you accountable all the way through, graduate school is going to be a big challenge, right? Because all of a sudden that independence is dumped on you. You're the one that has to decide, is this going to happen or not? And especially when you have teammates who are counting on you, it becomes important to be able to get up in the morning and get some work done. So we're thinking about time broadly, but the only way to actually change how you use your time is to look at it, right? And in this case, it helps to actually audit your time. And that means I would recommend at some point, maybe when you're getting started in a grad program, or maybe do it now, right? Or wherever you are in the process, it might be worth looking at. Spend a week of your time carefully tracking where each hour goes. And this is one of those tricky things, because it's hard to be honest with yourself sometimes and say, oh, I really did just watch Tiger King on Netflix for all episodes in a row, right? 7 hours straight or something. Um, okay, it's not always going to be like that, right? Like every week is a little bit different. But that's why it's useful to sit down and audit your time for a week, because then at least you get a decent idea of the daily patterns that emerge. And the reason why you want to do this is because you're going to look at that later and find out, like, oh, there's a lot of time that I actually have that I'm not really accounting for very well. Or there's a lot of time that I have in transit, maybe, or a lot of time that I have, in the evenings or in the early morning or something that maybe I'm not making the most of that I could be. And by making the most of, I don't mean you need to be working 24/7. Although in graduate school you might feel like that, especially if you're maintaining a full-time job or even a part-time job, as well as going to school, as well as dealing with other parts of your life, relationships, families, all that kind of stuff. You're going to be crunched for time no matter what, right? So we are kind of looking for more time, but we're also looking for where time becomes more efficient. One thing you might notice if you track each of your hours for a week is that I don't necessarily use time the way I think I do. And maybe in the mornings, I set aside a lot of time in the morning to get things done, but it turns out when I do, I'm really happy, because in 2 hours I get this massive amount of work done. And then maybe in the late afternoon, I think I have this nice stretch of like, oh, there's like 3 or 4 hours I can get my projects done or do research. And really, I'm massively inefficient. It's because I get so tired by the time 6 o'clock rolls around, I'm just done for, right? And that last couple hours is a waste. And so maybe from the time audit, I realized like, oh, I just need to restructure how I'm doing things. And maybe I need to allow myself to get up a little bit earlier, or maybe I need to stay up a little bit later, or whatever it is, excuse me, to make that thing happen. And I can do that, right? That's an option I have. And the other side of doing this time audit is it's also a good way to start resisting that impulse to put things off to the last minute that has driven you to this point in your life. Like all humans, you procrastinate. Maybe not everything, but some things. I procrastinate some things. And what you find out is that, yeah, some things are pretty easy to set aside because you know exactly how long they take. But when you start setting aside work and projects and research and, presentations that are going to take an unknown amount of time that you have no idea how much work is going to go into, you're going to run into some problems, right? And that's where the stress comes from. So one thing we try to do with these time audits is figure out, like, where am I in what's called the firefighting zone. That's what Stephen Covey calls it. And it's the zone where I'm just, everything is falling apart. I'm just trying to prop it all back up until it crushes me, right? The problem with the firefighting zone is you can't do that 24/7, right? It's exhausting. Like, if you spend your whole finals week staying up every night, and for some reason believing this will actually help you do better on exams, because it will not help you. After that week, you're just going to crash so hard the next week you're going to be useless, right? You can't do that constantly. And graduate school will just eat you alive if you have that kind of tendency to try to burn yourself out constantly over and over again, because it will not work. And putting things off to the last minute will not work, right? The kind of work you have to produce in graduate school consistently has to be of a quality that requires you to not wait for the last minute, right? So that's what the time audit's kind of there for, is to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to find some time and I'm going to start this now, because if I start it now, it might actually be done when it's due, right? And I might not lose my mind along the way. And so the second T I want to look at here is thinking about texts, right? So this is where research comes in. All the work you do in graduate school is research, right? I mean, that's effectively what it is. You'll probably have some classes, and you'll probably have some amount of teaching potentially, or, other work or projects or, committees you're involved in or whatever, right? Academia is sort of predictable. But you're going to research no matter what, and you're going to write. And so if you get used to looking at text in a way that's efficient, you can manage that, because that's the other hard part about being a professional researcher, even if this is only for a certain time in your life, is that there's a lot of stuff out there, right? People have thought about things for a long time. They've written about things for a long time. There's always more and more and more we could research, right? There's so much knowledge out there that we have access to, and that we might think, in theory, I need to be able to talk about all this stuff. But the reality is, you have limited time, you have limited perspective, right? So how do you deal with that? How are you able to sort of get the work into your head without, running out of brain cells to cover it? And so that's where you really want to think about how you approach texts. You want to think about the Pareto principle for this, and that's the idea that 20% of almost anything, right, contains 80% of the really valuable stuff. And this is a really interesting principle, because you think like it's sort of arbitrary, and it kind of is arbitrary. But there's a lot of really interesting relationships between like 80-20 splits in life. But what I have found personally, to be true about this, is that when I look at an article or I open up a new book or something like that, you find out that the book is not distributed evenly, right? Like, the useful stuff in the book tends to show up in specific places, tends to show up in the front, right? If you're looking at a journal article, where's the useful stuff? It's in the abstract, right? And then maybe in the introduction, and then maybe in the conclusion, in the middle we can kind of gloss. Now, I'm not saying this to say that you need to be some kind of, lazy researcher and never actually read anything. What I'm saying is that when you read, you want to make sure you're focusing on the stuff that has real value. Finding the 20% of the text that's really useful and has 80% of the value for you, right? So read those abstracts, read those introductions, and if you don't understand those, go figure them out before you move on to the rest of it, right? Because it's just going to get worse from there. And so think about that. Like, when you're reading, because you're going to be reading so much, you're going to be writing so much, like, how do you effectively, get the information out that you need and use it, put it to work for you? And so that's what we're talking about with research efficiency, is saying, can you find the 20% that's most useful? I mean, that was one thing that would happen when I was writing my dissertation, is that I would be picking up a book and I'd be skimming through it, and I would say, oh, this part of this chapter is useful, and I'd write down notes on that 20% or 2% of the book or whatever it was. And then I'd say, all right, the rest of this doesn't apply to me, toss it over the shoulder. Maybe not literally. And that's how I survived, right? I managed to get through text because I didn't have to read every single word. So make sure that your idea of reading has evolved from when you were in first grade and when you're in 12th grade and when you were in 16th grade, right? Because reading works differently in graduate school. And writing also works differently. Your goal now is no longer to be verbose and fill those pages, it's to be concise and delete those pages, right? Because you strengthen your writing through deletion, through concision, by getting rid of anything that doesn't need to be there, right? And that's your big goal as a professional writer for whatever amount of time you're a professional writer, because that's kind of what you are when you're in grad school, is you're deciding what can go out, right? Maybe I don't need these adjectives. Maybe they already understand this piece of it. I can drop that out. Okay. And the third piece I want to look at, another T here, is your tendencies. So this kind of builds on both of those prior two options. Thinking about time, how does that lead to tendencies and habits and behaviors that happen over and over again? And texts, what do I see when I encounter other people's ideas? Like, how does that influence what I think? Where does the stress come out of? What do I worry about? Like, what is it that I'm actually trying to say? And how has somebody else said that, maybe in a better or worse way? How can I build on that? And so by tendencies, I'm really thinking about, several different pieces of your own psyche, right, that can either help or hinder you as you work through graduate school. And the first one I've already kind of touched on is procrastination, right? Like, do you have a tendency to procrastinate and wait to the last minute to get work done? And that is one tendency you really need to work on now. If that's a problem that you have, if that's an issue that's come up for you in the past, you want to be thinking about that, because the more you procrastinate, the more you put things off, the more you're going to spend your life in that firefighting zone. And the stress is very destructive, or can be very destructive. And it can be a hindrance on whether or not you're going to finish. And that's the key thing about graduate school, right? Like, for the amount of money and time that you're putting in, if you don't finish, you're going to regret it. And I don't say that to create more stress. I just say that because it's true. If you go through all that work and don't have the credentials to show for it, and don't have the self-development to show for it, or the progress towards your goals to show for it, then what was the point, right? So this is where you're really honestly looking at yourself and saying, if my tendency is to put things off and do things at the last minute and to potentially turn in shoddy work because I can get away with it, you really want to look that over a little bit, right? Because I'm all about efficiency and pragmatism, right? Getting the work done as opposed to being a perfectionist. But at the same time, graduate school is a higher level. It's a higher bar than undergraduate work. And whatever you got away with before, you might not get away with now, right? At least put in the effort until you know how much you need to put in. Because that's one thing that happens is a lot of times, if you're going to graduate school, you know how academia works, right? You know how schools work. You're a smart kid, or a smart adult. And so you might say, well, I've always been fine, right? Like, I've always known how to take tests. I've always known how to write papers. And, like, that's great. But it's different now. The papers look different. The tests look very different, right? I never had to take an oral exam as an undergrad. I did not. And that's an entirely different beast than a written exam. Much more stressful, and you have to prepare for it very, very differently. Same thing with writing, right? As an undergrad, I never got marked down on a paper because I was a decent writer, and that already puts you above the curve in a lot of ways. But then in graduate school, it turns out everyone is a decent writer. And suddenly I had to actually learn how to write because I wasn't getting the same feedback I was before. And I said, now's as good a time as any to, like, figure out my tendencies, right? Because that was one of my tendencies too, was to write a lot and to go on and on and on and on, because that was never a problem as an undergrad. And then as a grad student, it was like, you know what, this doesn't make it better. This doesn't strengthen your writing. Like, learning to be concise is what makes that better. And then also thinking about your own tendencies towards independence versus, building, something with somebody else, working on a team. And depending on your graduate program, you're probably going to have a more independent experience than you did before as an undergraduate. And that's sort of the nature of the beast, right? Research in many ways is independent. As much as you'll work in labs, from time to time, you'll work on teams, you'll have projects. So many of those hours are going to be spent in your own head, right? And then encountering other people's heads in their writing and so on and so forth in their data. But it's not necessarily a place where your team can bail you out. If you're having problems, a lot of times it really is going to come down to you. It doesn't mean you don't have any support. It just means that if you were a person who really thrived in a team environment before, you might struggle with graduate school. You might find that it's not nearly as easy as undergraduate was, or it doesn't come as naturally as undergraduate was. You might find out that you're quite skilled at working on your own, but it might look different now, and that might mean reframing your life, right? The last couple of years of my graduate school experience, I just spent at home writing a dissertation and occasionally going to campus and teaching, right? So I was literally with myself, 10 hours a day working and writing and writing and working and writing and reading and writing and working and reading. And if I wasn't the kind of person that functioned well in that environment, I would have had a really hard time. But I don't mind that because I don't like people, right? No, just kidding. Half kidding. But knowing your tendencies and saying, like, is this going to be difficult for me? If I'm an extroverted person, if I really thrive on, group work and I need that constant input from professors, and so on and so forth, is this going to be the right program for me? And if not, I need to adjust, right? Or adjust my own expectations to be ready for that. And so again, it comes down to pragmatism. Can I do the things I need to do in order to have success? Or can I make the changes I need to make because they will have good effects for me? And I think it's easy to be a perfectionist when your whole world is school and academia. But as soon as you get to graduate school, that's almost never true, right? You always have some other work to do. You always have other people in your life. You always have these places you're being pulled, the different directions that you have to sort of be able to cover, even though you're trying to get through graduate school, right? So even if this is your focus and your major focus, it's not necessarily going to bail you out, right? You're still going to have all these other things you have to deal with. So you got to be pragmatic about that and say, well, maybe I can't write a perfect paper. Maybe this research is just going to be what it's going to be, and we're going to have to cut it off because we don't have time to get to the rest of this sample pool, and we're just going to make it work somehow, right? Like learning to be okay with that and learning to be able to maybe cut things short or, eliminate certain choices or, find the shortcut that's there or take the hard route if that's the only thing there. Whatever it is you need to do to be able to make those choices and move forward without sitting there and constantly, antagonizing yourself about making those choices, that's pretty huge too. So if you're the kind of person that is perfectionistic, you want to lose that now because it's just going to get harder and harder to be that way later, and it's not going to help you. It's not good for your mind. Okay. The fourth T that I'm looking at is your tribe. So I'm thinking about your family. I'm thinking about, a significant other, people that you have relationships with, people who are part of your life, close friends who are going to maybe, follow you, if not physically, but certainly, psychologically as you go into this next stage of your life. Research has showed that having a really, supportive group of people around you can get you through, so many other challenges, right? When stress levels become impossible to deal with, when I can't function because of the amount of stress that's on me, having family around that can actually support you in that is pretty important. And having people that help take away the stress rather than adding to it is important. So if you are not in a relationship right now, or you don't have a family or kids or anything, you're going to have to find those support structures as you go, right? You're going to have to make the friends. You're going to have to do that. And what's good is other people have the same needs, right? So you're going to find plenty of connections in graduate school with other people who are in the same boat as you, who are there to support each other. And you should definitely seek those out. Because again, if the academic world does push you towards being independent and working independently, the further you go in it, it just should emphasize to you the need to have these other groups and have other people in your life who can help you sort through all that stuff. The other thing is, if you already have a family, you already have a relationship, et cetera, expect there to be strain and stress upon those relationships as you're in graduate school, because there's almost no way for that to not happen. And it doesn't mean you're doomed to break up with your significant other because of graduate school, but it does mean that you need to take that possibility seriously. And I mean that in a way of being proactive, not in being negative or reactive, right? I don't mean you should be cutting things off right now. I mean, that you need to build into your schedule the kinds of things that are going to link you with these other people, right? If my whole life is spent at the university doing research and my partner's whole life is spent, at work or not seeing me at home or wherever else, we're just not going to have much in common at the end of the day, right? So if I can actively say, like, I'm going to come home at 5 or I'm going to go home at 6 or whatever I need to do to say, even if there's still work to do, I'm going to prioritize this other part of my life because there's more to your life than just the schooling, right? And if you have to sacrifice everything for graduate school, I don't think it's really worth it. So find those limits for yourself, because that's another thing you'll notice about graduate school is that you could always work. There's always more work you could do. There's always more research you could do. There's always more reading and writing you could do. There's always a new group of people you could be, connecting with. And that's just, some people thrive on that, pushing themselves eternally and can manage that. And most normal humans cannot do that, right? We all have a limit as far as how much can I actually work and how much can I do and how much can I push myself before I realize this is not good for me, right? I'm having problems here. So find that balance early and say, okay, I'm going to find a way to not work on weekends. I mean, that might not be possible, right? Or I'm going to find a way to work Saturday mornings and then not again during the weekend. And I'm going to find a way to go home at 6 every day, no matter what, right? Maybe it doesn't always work, but having these goals can help you not just keep yourself together and, limit some of your own coping mechanisms that might not be as helpful, right, to cope with stress, but it can help you keep your family together, right, and value the things that are important. Because especially if you have kids, when you're in graduate school, they're going to grow really fast while you're in the library, right? And you don't want to miss that. And you want to step out on the other side of it and say, wow, I spent 5 years getting this program figured out and getting the next stage of my life, and I don't even know who my kids are anymore, right? No pressure or anything. And part of this thinking about your tribe or your family is thinking about who's on your side, right? Who's there to advocate for you? Who's there to support you? And you will need some support, because there's so much stuff in graduate school that's going to exhaust you that you really can't go it alone. You need to have some kind of support. You need to have some kind of foundation. And as much as you need to make time for them, and that's going to be, some drain on your energy, it's also going to be a provider of your energy, right? It's going to give you something to live for beyond just the next page of the next book. So think about that group, think about those people that are going to be there to hold you together when you can't hold yourself together very well. Because there's going to be plenty of days like that. The longer you stay, the more it gets like that. And this is especially true if you're doing an intensive program, right? Maybe you're only going to be in school for another 12 months or 15 months or 18 months. It just means you're going to be doing double the work in half the time, right? So I still need to be able to set aside some of those hours to be with my family and to just relax, right? To not do the things that are going to get in the way of me having, healthy relationships and also like a healthy, more or less, lifestyle, right? And then the fifth T I'm going to talk about here is, it's still important. I don't want to rank these, it's just the fifth one that came to mind. This is treasure, okay? So I'm obviously kind of reaching there with the thesaurus. But really I'm talking about your money. What's your money going to be doing while you're in graduate school? And the easy answer is to say flippantly, like, it'll be disappearing, right? Because that's what graduate school is there for, is to help your money disappear. But again, like undergraduate work, it's an investment. And this is what we say, to people who are considering whether or not to go to college, is that people who get college degrees, even if they assume student debt along the way, typically it's worth it in the long term, because the earning power they get from having that degree will pay off the student debt and then some, right? Graduate school is a fuzzier calculus, because whether it's worth it really depends on what you need it for and what you pay for it, right? And for some programs, you're going to get assistance from your work. They're going to put you through it. That's a no-brainer, right? If you can get there for free, take it. Or if you get an assistantship that pays all your tuition, and pays you some small amount to teach classes, and they take it, right? If you can go to graduate school for free, you absolutely take that option, okay? For most of us, that's not necessarily a possibility. In which case you really have to be conscious of, how am I going to fund my way through this? And so being aware of, time frames on repaying student loans is important, and being aware of, your own priorities as far as debts that you've already incurred is crucial. But also just thinking in general, like, what is this program going to do for me financially? Like, is it going to put me in a better position when I get out of it than when I started, or is it just going to compound a problem that I might have already had? So what you want to be thinking about is that balance between the different kinds of investments you're making. There's monetary investments, obviously, that you excuse me, will not be making because you're in graduate school and because that money is going somewhere else. But there's also, personal investments that you're making. Like, you're growing yourself as a person, right? You're getting yourself closer towards your long-term goals. You're also investing in your career path and in your earning power and potential and all that stuff down the road, right? There's this building of yourself that you're doing, and even if the foundation costs this much money, there's probably an argument there that says it's worth it. Again, you want to be doing those calculations though before you start. Just going to any program anywhere just to have gone to graduate school is not a good idea, right? Make sure that you are obligated to go to graduate school. Like, if you go to graduate school without needing to go, I feel like you're going to regret it most of the time. If you go because you have to go in order to get to the next stage of your career, or to, make some progress, or to, figure out a solution to a goal you have, right? Even for personal reasons, that can be totally worth it. But don't do it just because you don't know what else to do. And I think right now that's actually an important point to make, because the economy is once again going in interesting directions. And that's something that's always going to do, right? And there are the fluctuations, like when we hit recessions, when things contract a little bit in the economy, it's easier in some ways to say, now's a good time to go to school because maybe the jobs aren't out there, and maybe I need to, re-educate myself in a new direction so that I can find a new job in a new industry, and so on and so forth. So we see some of those fluctuations when the market changes, but you also want to keep in mind that you're not here to be part of a trend, right? Like, you're not here to be a statistic. You're here because you need this for yourself. And so if graduate work is what you need to do in order to advance to the next stage that you have, targeted, the next goal that you have, the next plan that you have, then do it, and don't worry about what the market's doing, right? And don't worry about what the economy looks like, and don't worry about your job in some ways. Although if you have one and you can maintain it through graduate school, you should try to do that, right? Prioritize what you already have, versus finding something new. But at the same time, like, don't let the larger trends dictate what you do. Just because the economy is doing one thing does not mean you should be reacting to it in that way necessarily. And I mean, I can look back and say, yes, I spent a long time in graduate school, and I sacrificed a lot of earning potential from that, but I feel like the trade-off for what I got and for what I have for the future is still worth it to me, despite whatever, calculations were made. And it also helped me a lot that my wife was working when I was in graduate school, so she was able to help me sort of keep things afloat, during a time when otherwise we would have been really in trouble financially, because I did not make that much money as a graduate teaching assistant, turns out. But whatever investments we might have made, I feel like the investments we did make were worth more. So when you're thinking about treasure, you're not just thinking about how much cash you have, right? Or how much cash you might be gaining or losing because of graduate school. You're also thinking about what are the things that you value, right? Like, what are the ethics that you're chasing after? Like, what are the purposes that you're interested in? Because you can spend your life doing things that you feel ambivalent about. And I don't know that you treasure a life like that, right? Like, just because you have the pay doesn't mean you have the purpose. And it's really important to think about, why am I doing this, beyond just the money, or just beyond, this is just a check off requirement for the next step that I need to do. Because if you don't find some ultimate purpose and some treasure in the work that you're doing in graduate school, you're going to have a much harder time getting through it, and you're going to have a harder time justifying it, and you're just going to resent most of it, honestly. And so try not to go into it with that kind of mindset. If you can avoid that at all, and think about, like, what is it that I can get out of this place rather than what all is this place trying to get out of me, you're going to have a better experience with that. And like I said at the beginning, it comes down to, what do you need to do for yourself, right? Like, what are the things that you're chasing after? What are you interested in? What are the questions that drive you that can't be answered anywhere else? And if that's an answer, if the answer to that is, I got to go to grad school to do these things, then do that. And if it's not, then consider not doing it, because it's not a solution to problems that are not defined, right? Like, it's a solution to problems that are very clearly defined. And if you don't have one of those problems, then it may just create more problems than it's worth. But I think the pursuit of learning is worth it no matter what. So even if you don't go to graduate school, keep reading, keep studying, keep learning, because that's where you're going to find a lot of the real value in all of this. Thanks for listening. Get in touch if you're interested in hearing more. Take care.